When 9/11 happened, everything in the Army changed. What had been a predictable cycle of field problems, NTC rotations, and training schedules suddenly shifted into a new reality, a war footing that demanded more discipline, more readiness, and more sacrifice than anything before it. By the time America entered this new era, I was solid in my craft as a 12B. We were stable in Ogden, Kansas. My son Sean was playing baseball. I was coaching his basketball team. And for the first time in years, life felt steady. It felt normal. Then the Army reminded me that normal never lasts. I was DA selected for drill sergeant duty. Everything shifted overnight. The orders felt like they came out of nowhere, one of those career-defining moments you don't get to negotiate with. I tried to get out of it, but Branch made it clear. If I failed drill sergeant school, they would keep sending me back until I passed. At the same time, the uncertainty and distance of military life were catching up with my marriage. Years of deployments, separations, and rumors had worn me down. Somewhere along the way, I convinced myself not to worry anymore. Not because things were fine, but because I was tired of being afraid of what I couldn't control. So I told myself, whatever happens, happens. And with that mindset, good or bad, I left for drill sergeant school. Fort Leonard Wood felt like the obvious assignment, but instead, the Army sent me to the Deep South, to Fort Benning, Georgia. It was nothing like what I expected. The culture was different, the environment was different, and the temptations were different. Drill sergeant school itself was miserable. Basic training all over again, except now the pressure was higher and the expectations were brutal. I made the commandant's list, hoping it would earn me a slot at Fort Leonard Wood so I could get my family closer to home. But the schoolhouse chose to keep me at Benning, and that's where the trouble really began. The loneliness, the separation from my family, the culture around the installation, and the emotional distance already creeping into my marriage pushed me into choices that filled a short-term void but created long-term consequences. It wasn't about lust, it was about isolation, the kind that eats at you quietly, especially when you've spent a lifetime feeling alone. That 60-day period became the start of a personal battle I didn't see coming, the one I call the war with the Swifties. It wasn't about women, it was about loneliness, vulnerability, and the human need for connection that I never learned how to manage in a healthy way. This was the beginning of my post-9/11 service, not on a battlefield, but inside myself. After receiving orders for drill sergeant duty, I knew life was about to get harder, not easier. I'd hoped for stability, a chance to bring my family closer and reset after years of deployments and losses. Instead, I was thrown into one of the most demanding roles in the Army, while being more alone than ever. When I first arrived at Fort Benning, I realized quickly that the environment wasn't where I needed to be if I wanted to keep myself grounded. Right across the street from one of the clubs was a church, Christ Community Church. I didn't know it then, but that's where I needed to be. Not in the nightlife, not in the noise, but in a place where I could rebuild the parts of myself I had forgotten. Looking back now, shame kept me from walking through those doors, the kind of shame that makes you feel like you've drifted too far from who you once were. But the truth is simple. Nobody should walk into a church with their head down. The first step through that door is already a victory. Here's another indicator that God kept seeking me out, even in my most lost moments and broken places, guiding me like a beacon, just waiting to offer his love and heal my brokenness. When drill sergeant school ended, I checked into the battalion and moved into the barracks. Tua and the kids were still in Missouri while we tried to sell the house in Kansas. The loneliness hit hard and money was tight. My days were long, 0400 to 2200 during total control, and I was sending nearly everything I earned back home. My first cycle as a drill sergeant was chaos. I had one other drill sergeant who was my partner, who was already an experienced performer of the duties. When he tore his Achilles tendon, I was suddenly alone running an entire platoon, and this was my first cycle. I didn't know how daily operations worked, and I leaned heavily on the other drills until Fortenberry came over to show me the ropes. Those guys saved me. They were solid NCOs, and I needed every bit of help I could get. But even with good people around me, drill sergeant duty consumed everything. The hours, the stress, the constant pressure to perform, it all weighed on me. By the time my family arrived and we moved into Indian Head Terrace, I was exhausted. The job demanded everything I had, and Tua carried the entire burden of the home. Meanwhile, the neighborhood around us was full of gossip, affairs, and rumors, the kind of environment where marriages went to die. Even when you weren't involved, you lived inside the noise. Fort Benning became the place where I tried to hold everything together: fatherhood, marriage, leadership, and my own identity, while the world around me, inside and outside the uniform, kept pulling me in different directions. Fort Benning had already become a test of who I was as a man, a husband, and a father. But drill sergeant life doesn't slow down for anyone, not even for a struggling family. Every choice came with a cost, and the next chapter would test every part of me. During the rare moments I actually had time off, I tried to make the most of it. I bought a small boat so I could take the kids out on the lake, even though those moments were few and far between. Most of the time, they were home with Toa or the neighbors, while I was working 18 to 20-hour days. Our neighborhood was full of schoolhouse instructors and garrison NCOs, people who went home at regular hours. My kids saw other dads around far more than they saw me, and I'm sure they wondered why their father was always gone. That's the truth most people don't see about drill sergeant duty. The pay never comes close to the sacrifice. Around this time, Toa told me she wanted a real career. She applied to work for Halliburton, and after a few arguments, I agreed. Part of me wanted her to have something of her own after years of carrying the weight of the household alone. But everything changed when our company was selected to deploy to Iraq. Only 5 drill sergeants from the entire installation, chosen for a mission that required discipline, cohesion, and trust. I didn't have a choice. I called Toa and told her she needed to come home so I could deploy. She refused. She told me she wanted her career, and for the first time, I felt completely stuck between duty and family. I called my mom, and she stepped up without hesitation. Within days, I had the kids packed and on a plane to California. I was clearing housing alone, selling the boat, storing my truck, and trying to keep my head above water while preparing to go to war. On the day I checked out of our on-post quarters at Indian Head Terrace, the woman across the street offered me a ride to the barracks. On the way, she mentioned something Toa had told her, that Halliburton jobs overseas were fun, that Djibouti had lots of guys, and that she should apply. I remember thinking, I sent my kids home for this? But the truth was simple. It didn't matter. I had my orders, the mission came next, and just like that, I deployed. Leaving my kids and clearing that house at Fort Benning felt like the hardest thing I had ever done, until the world dropped me into a mission that didn't make sense to anyone. After the heartbreak of sending my children to California and closing the door on everything familiar, I reported for pre-deployment operations at Fort Bliss. For the first time in months, something felt organized. But the moment we landed in theater, the order collapsed into chaos. Every unit we linked up with asked the same question: why the hell are drill sergeants in Iraq? We didn't have an answer. We were a 5-man team pulled out of the schoolhouse and pushed into a war zone without a clear mission, shuffled across bases until the Army finally attached us to the 173rd in northern Iraq. They had parachuted in months before. We were coming in blind. And just like that, everything shifted from uncertainty to survival. We barely settled into the mission when the moment came that would define our entire deployment. Up to that point, we had been training the ICDC, men who had lived under tyranny their entire lives, men who had learned that resistance meant death not just for themselves, but for their families. You could see it in the way they carried themselves, quiet, careful, bracing for consequences even when they were doing the right thing. Then the call came. A checkpoint south of Fob Bernstein, the one manned entirely by our ICDC battalion, had been overrun by insurgents. Several of their men were killed. The rest refused to go back. Not because they were cowards, but because where they came from, death wasn't the worst punishment. Retribution was. They had lived through decades of chemical attacks, purges, disappearances, and executions carried out by Saddam's regime. In their battalion headquarters, an entire wall was dedicated to photographs of Kurdish families, men, women, and children, gassed to death. This was their legacy. This was the weight they carried. And now they were being asked to stand against the very people who once hunted them. The battalion was collapsing under fear. Men were crying, packing up to desert, begging not to be sent back. Their families had already paid too high a price. That's when it happened, the moment that still stays with me. It was just 4 drill sergeants, me, SFC Clark, and 2 others, standing in the courtyard with a handful of Peshmerga veterans. The Peshmerga didn't run. They had their own reasons for staying in the fight, a vision of a free Kurdistan, a hatred of anyone connected to Saddam, and a history of surviving everything the world had thrown at them. And so the 6 of us, 4 Americans and a couple of hardened Kurdish fighters, manned that checkpoint ourselves, all night, in the dark, in the cold, in the most dangerous stretch of road in northern Iraq. There was no backup yet, no reinforcements, no comfort, just us. And for those hours, we weren't Americans and Kurds. We were brothers, bound by a shared enemy and a shared understanding of what happens when evil is allowed to grow unchecked. SFC Clark and the Special Forces lieutenant who oversaw our mission held it together like seasoned commanders. Their calm meant everything to the men around them. You could almost feel people's courage returning, inch by inch, as they watched us hold the line. When coalition forces finally arrived the next morning, they detained 3 insurgents involved in the attack. It was a small victory, but to the ICDC, after losing their men, it meant everything. We were ordered to pick up the detainees. That's when I found myself climbing into what we called the shit truck. It was a civilian Nissan pickup the Iraqis used. No armor, no ballistic glass, just thin metal and prayer. When I slid into the seat, the stench slapped me in the face. I looked at my Kurdish driver. "Did you shit your pants?" I asked. He waved both hands. No, Clark. And then it hit me. This was the truck SFC Clark had been in on a mission during a bout of dysentery. He refused to take a day off because Clark never took a day off, and the truck never recovered. It smelled like death on a humid day. So there I was, rolling toward the checkpoint in the legendary shit truck, window down so a blast wouldn't send glass into my face. When we arrived, the insurgents were zip-cuffed, sandbags over their heads, and coalition forces handed 1 detainee to each of us. We loaded them into our trucks and headed back. On the ride up, I heard soft whimpering. I glanced at my mirror and saw the ICDC guys sneaking punches at the detainee, hitting him in the ribs every time I hit a bump. Every leadership class in the Army tells you that detainees must not be abused. Every policy says you intervene. But then I saw the faces of those Kurdish fighters, men who had lived through genocide, men who had carried dead children out of basements after chemical strikes. And I thought, I'm not stepping in. Not today. Not after what this bastard did. Maybe that makes me flawed. Maybe it makes me human. But I wasn't stopping it. When we rolled into the compound, the crowd erupted. The ICDC men were cheering, clapping, shouting. You would have thought we returned from liberating a town. In a way, we had. We brought them proof that the killers who attacked their checkpoint were caught. It gave them a taste of justice, something they hadn't felt under Saddam in decades. The Special Forces lieutenant took over the interrogation, and for the first time since the attack, the battalion felt safe enough to stop running. That night changed everything for me. The courage of the Kurdish men, the fear in the ICDC's eyes, the unity between strangers, the way leadership, real leadership, can stabilize an entire battalion. This was the moment when war stopped being theory or mission briefs. It became human, and it marked the beginning. As the months passed, northern Iraq began to shift and settle beneath us. The 173rd eventually handed the sector to the 25th Infantry Division, but our small team of drill sergeants stayed behind, still training the ICDC, still holding together a region that had seen more suffering than most Americans could imagine. But nothing prepared me for what happened in our final month. We were pulled from the mountains and sent south to Tikrit, Saddam Hussein's stronghold. The mission was surreal. Take the palaces of a dictator and convert them into training headquarters for the new Iraqi army. Marble halls, gold-plated faucets, chandeliers the size of vehicles. Everything Saddam used to glorify himself was now being repurposed into a place where Iraq's future soldiers would be built. But the moment that stays etched in my mind didn't happen inside those palaces. It happened outside, when the Kurds came. They drove hundreds of miles from the north in a handful of old pickups, rolling into Tikrit covered in dust and road grit, with the same stubborn pride that had carried them through decades of persecution. No escort, no protection, just men with loyalty in their veins instead of blood. These were the same Kurds who stood beside us when their checkpoint was overrun, the same men who fought while others fled, who bore the scars of chemical attacks, who lived through massacres and still stood tall. They had lost families, homes, entire villages, yet they came all that distance just to say goodbye. When they stepped out of their trucks, it felt like seeing family you didn't know you had until war introduced you. One of our interpreters, standing to my left, sunglasses on, leaned over and told me something that cut deeper than anything I expected. My life was better before the invasion. He wasn't Kurdish, he wasn't persecuted. Under Saddam, he'd been a university student, with a job waiting and a wife he loved. After the invasion, his world collapsed. That was Iraq in one sentence. Your truth depended entirely on where you stood in Saddam's shadow. For the Kurds, we were liberators. For others, we were an earthquake, uprooting every part of their lives. But for that moment, in the dusty lot outside Saddam's palace, those Kurdish soldiers embraced us like brothers. They thanked us, not for victory or power or politics, but for standing with them when everyone else ran. When they said goodbye, they said it the only way men forged in war know how. Tu havala mini, you are my brother. In that moment, after everything we'd seen and survived, it felt true. When we left the mountains of northern Iraq and rolled into Tikrit, it felt like entering a different world. Up north, everything was raw. Dust, checkpoints, diesel fumes, fear in the eyes of new Iraqi recruits who weren't sure they'd survive the next night. Tikrit was the opposite. It was Saddam's hometown, and the opulence still clung to the place like a bad smell. The original purpose of our deployment finally materialized here. We were officially attached to the 4th Infantry Division to transform one of Saddam's palaces into a training academy for the new Iraqi army. Basic training, NCO schooling, everything from drill and ceremony to leadership development. Marble floors, gold fixtures, chandeliers the size of Humvees. And there we were, 4 drill sergeants and a handful of interpreters, turning a dictator's monument to ego into a place where young Iraqis would learn discipline, structure, and the foundations of a real army. We divided into 2 missions running side by side. 1, build the curriculum. 2, renovate and construct the facility itself. SSG Fortenberry was crucial. He had worked at the Fort Benning schoolhouse as a sniper instructor, so he understood doctrine inside and out. I handled the technical side, converting US computers to Arabic settings, adding keyboards, building the digital infrastructure so our interpreters could develop lesson plans in their own language. It was surreal watching Arabic script fill computer screens inside Saddam's old office. But the strangest moment came in the DFAC. A group of young soldiers sat behind us, talking loudly about how they weren't shaving until they had a confirmed kill. Mustaches thick, chests puffed out. One of them said, "We're here to kill the enemy." Fortenberry turned around, calm but razor sharp, and asked, "Is that what you think professionalism looks like?" They stared at him. "We are here to kill the enemy," one repeated. Fortenberry shook his head. "No, we're here to maintain peace and help establish democracy." It was the cleanest, most mature explanation of war I'd ever heard another soldier say out loud. And he was right. Combat isn't about bloodlust. It's about protecting people, even people who will never know your name. That mindset was reinforced every day we spent in Tikrit. Compared to Fob Bernstein, this place looked like the army version of a resort. A giant DFAC, a massive PX, full MWR facilities, even a pool. We didn't have any of that in the north. Ironically, the only time I got dysentery the entire deployment was after eating in the Tikrit DFAC, the nicest one in Iraq. The atmosphere was different too. Contractors, soldiers, and special operations guys lived in their own ecosystem. In the DFAC one day, a female contractor mentioned a tiki bar the soft guys had built, hidden somewhere on base, where they drank Jack Daniels and partied hard despite General Order 1. She said half the women on base were sleeping with someone. Special operations soldiers were treated like rock stars. Some of the female contractors became what the guys called queen for a year, ordinary women who suddenly became the most sought-after people in the area simply because they were women in a war zone. The environment was a shock. Northern Iraq had been fear, dust, checkpoints, and death. Tikrit was luxury, temptation, boredom, and moral drift. That contrast stayed with me. Because even in Saddam's palace, surrounded by chandeliers and a pool, I never forgot those Kurdish men holding the line at that checkpoint. Never forgot what the war looked like in places where no one had safety, comfort, or certainty. When I came home from Iraq, I thought I finally had a chance to rebuild my life. I moved into a rental house in northern Columbus, and for a brief moment, it felt like things might settle. Tua came back from Africa, and for a while we tried to reconnect, tried to act like the distance and the deployments hadn't carved cracks into the foundation of our marriage. I bought a house from the same woman who rented us our first one. I thought, this is where I'll retire. I can finish out my last 5 years here. But deep down, both of us knew things were changing. When Tua got frustrated with a job at Aflac and told me she wanted another contract overseas, this time in Iraq, I didn't fight her. Maybe I was tired. Maybe I already knew we were drifting beyond repair. She arranged for her sister to watch the kids. Our focus wasn't on each other anymore, just survival, schedules, and trying to keep the kids steady while everything else came apart. I worked constantly. Most days I left at 04:30 and didn't get back until evening. I caught what moments I could with my son at football or wrestling, and I took the girls to the skating rink when I was free. But the loneliness wore on me. I was exhausted, isolated, and carrying everything alone. One night, needing something, anything, to feel normal, I rode my motorcycle to a country bar. I figured maybe line dancing and two-stepping would help me breathe again, take the edge off. I was drunk, lonely, and looking for company, not trouble. I met a woman who showed me attention, and in a moment of weakness, I went home with her. What happened next changed my life. I later learned that the person who took me home had deceived me about who they were. The entire situation had been a lie from the beginning, planned, intentional, and carried out without any regard for my safety, dignity, or consent. When the truth came out, it felt like the floor collapsed beneath me. I didn't go out looking for anything extreme or risky. I thought I was meeting a woman at a bar. What I got was deception that violated every boundary I had. I remember sitting in my bathroom on Bradford Drive, the shotgun loaded, the door closed, my dog outside scratching and whining because he knew something was wrong. The humiliation hit hard, but what hit even harder was the feeling that I had been tricked, played with, and violated. I felt used and stripped of something I didn't know I could lose. I nearly pulled the trigger that night. The only thing that stopped me was the thought of my kids. If I had been an alcoholic or dealing with addiction, I honestly don't know if I'd still be here. The only thing that gave me enough clarity to fight it was knowing that if I died, they'd carry the weight forever. So I put the gun down, sat on the cold shower floor, and tried to breathe through a humiliation I didn't ask for and didn't understand. As the truth spread, distorted, mocked, twisted, my life became a target range. People talked, people whispered, people exaggerated. I experienced humiliation, stalking, rumors, and sexual harassment from people who thought it was funny, who didn't know or didn't care that deception is not consent, and that trauma is trauma, no matter who it happens to. It followed me for years, into my unit, into social circles, into Germany at JMRC, even into the VA years later. People turned it into a joke, even people who had never deployed, never seen combat, never carried what I carried. They used it as a weapon because it made them feel superior. That's how insecurity works. I developed sexual trauma symptoms and severe self-confidence issues. Back then, MST wasn't talked about for men at all. Nobody even acknowledged that men could be victims. There was no support, no policy, no understanding, just shame. At one point, desperate and struggling, I started ordering Cialis online. Not because I was broken, but because trauma rewires the way your mind and body communicate. And I was too ashamed to tell anyone. Looking back, I understand something now. Deception is not consent. Humiliation is not justice. And no human being deserves to be targeted or stalked for a trauma they never asked for. I survived because of my kids, and because deep down, I still believed I had something left to live for. Coming out of the darkest period of my life, I wasn't myself anymore. The humiliation, the isolation, the constant pressure of being a single father and a drill sergeant had hollowed me out. I'd go to work, coach what I could, keep moving, keep grinding, but inside, I was empty, lonely in a way that sits in your bones. I needed connection, not sex, connection. Something to remind me I was still human, still worthy of being wanted. And then, out of nowhere, she appeared. I met a female drill sergeant at Fort Benning who made me feel something I hadn't felt in a long time: valued. She was blonde, sharp, confident, and one of the most naturally beautiful women I've ever known. Not because of how she looked, but because of how she saw me. She made me feel like a man again, right when I believed I had nothing left to offer. One night, after running the night infiltration course, I still had camouflage on my face and dirt on my uniform from crawling through the red Georgia clay with the trainees. She lived in the barracks, technically still at work, and with CQ duties and trainees down the hall, I was in the area, so I wasn't breaking any rules. She asked me to come by. I'll never forget the look in her eyes when the door opened. Warm, soft, unguarded. For the first time in a long time, I felt wanted without conditions. We talked, we kissed, and for one night, the world outside stopped hurting. It wasn't the sex that stayed with me. It was her gentleness, her warmth, her presence. She gave me back a piece of myself I thought I'd lost forever. For months afterward, I held on to that memory like a lifeline, a candle in a dark room, a reminder that I wasn't invisible, that someone, somewhere, once looked at me like I mattered. Sometimes I imagine us sitting at a table with candles flickering, her face glowing in the soft light, her voice gentle, her hand reaching behind my head as she kissed me. And then the image dissolves, like fog disappearing in the morning. A beautiful moment I can't return to, but one that still brings warmth when I think of it. She left soon after. Orders, life, timing, whatever the reason, she was gone. And once again, I was alone. She used to put on Brad Paisley's Mud on the Tires. Sometimes when that song plays, I remember us driving in my lifted Chevy, dirt flying behind us, windows down, laughing like life wasn't so damn heavy. Whoever ended up with her is a lucky man. And though that moment was brief, it gave me hope. The same kind of hope a quarterback gets after losing Super Bowls, but then finishes strong. I used to call it my John Elway recovery process. If I finished my story strong, maybe the failures and pain wouldn't define me. Then the Army, like always, stepped in with a plot twist. I received orders for Germany. I tried everything to get out of them. The kids, the situation, the instability, but it didn't matter. The Army said go, and so I went. I cared about that woman, not because of intimacy, but because she reminded me that I was still capable of connection. I wasn't someone who used people, I bonded with them. And if I'm honest, I didn't know how to make friends with men back then. Women always felt safer to talk to, more accepting, less judgmental. She wasn't a mistake. She was a moment of grace in a life that, at that time, felt like nothing but loss. And she helped me believe I still had something good left inside me. I remember the week before I left for Germany like it still sits in the center of my chest. Orders hit, and just like that, my entire life was about to shift across an ocean. I had begged, fought, and hoped that Tua would come back home so the kids could be with both of us before I left. But she didn't come back. Not then. I couldn't understand it. Part of me wanted to be angry. Another part wanted to believe she just needed space. But underneath all of it was something harder, the feeling that my kids needed both of us, and instead they were getting neither. So when the time came and I had to leave them with their Aunt Tino, the guilt hit me like a freight train. I felt like I was abandoning them, not because I wanted to, but because service doesn't negotiate with your heart. It simply demands. And the army doesn't care what you're going through at home. Orders are orders. There is one moment I will never forget. It replays in my memory like a slow motion film I never learned how to stop. Abriona had a school project to build a toothpick bridge. Something simple, something small, but to her, it was everything. I knew in my heart that no amount of glue or toothpicks could fix what I was about to break by leaving. Still, I tried. I stayed up building the bridge with her, both of us pretending that if we just focused on this one little project long enough, time would slow down and give us one more week, one more day, one more minute. But the clock doesn't care who you love, and the army definitely doesn't. The next morning, I had to walk out that door. She stood in front of that toothpick bridge, her little hands touching it gently, her eyes full of everything a child shouldn't have to feel. She was crying, but not loud, just this soft, shaking cry that felt like it was pulling every part of me apart. I tried to tell her I'd be back. I tried to smile for her. But inside, I was breaking in ways I didn't know a man could break. And the hardest truth in the world hit me right then. Time doesn't pause. Time doesn't wait. And once you lose a moment with your child, you never get it back. When I left that house, I didn't just leave a bridge on the table. I left a piece of my heart next to it. By the time I would see her again, she wasn't a little girl anymore. She was growing into a woman, and I had missed the middle chapters. You always think you'll get those years back somehow. You don't. And that's when I learned the lesson that still haunts me today. You can rebuild a bridge out of toothpicks. You can't rebuild lost time with your kids. I didn't know it then, but the next flight would take me into a world where love, war, and fate would all meet me at once.